Good evening. Good to see everyone this cool evening. I know there's several watching online, texted me, so they weren't going to be here tonight, but they'd be watching, so if you're watching online, good to have you. Started talking about church leadership a little bit last Sunday or last Wednesday night, and want to continue on with that a little bit. Like I said, it's really important to me. Probably one of the more important aspects of kind of who we are as people is our leadership and the way that we run things. Because I think there is a biblical way for a church or an assembly, and I really hate that word church, but I think there is a biblically way for an assembly in any location to operate in a godly way, the way God would have us to operate. And I think leadership is a big part of that. I said last Sunday night that the church isn't a business, and that's true, but there is business of the church. It's one of those it's kind of an oxymoron, you know. And unfortunately, in our world, we have business that they didn't have in the first century, you know. In the first century church, they were mostly house churches, or they met wherever. They didn't have, probably for the most part, although there was a lot of instances of support, congregations supporting Paul, supporting ministers, supporting other churches or causes. So there's a lot of that in the New Testament. But, we really don't see the structure that the church or the assembly eventually developed into. And the early church, of course, didn't have issues like church buildings and vans and multiple ministers and insurance and things that, unfortunately we have to deal with in our world, today. So there is a lot of business to the church. And unfortunately, sometimes our elders get kind of bogged down in that instead of what they're supposed to be doing, which is the spiritual business of the church. In Acts, when the apostles, in Acts 7, when the apostles are 6 and 7, when they said, choose some men out from among you to minister to these widows because we need to be about the Lord's work, that was kind of what they were saying, was that, there's the elders have a spiritual position, spiritual leadership position, and many times we just look at them like managers of business, like they take care of the building and the lights getting left on, electric bill not getting paid, or the air conditioner goes out, or, and they do have to deal with a lot of that stuff, but that should not be their primary focus. Their primary focus should be the spiritual leadership of the church, not the financial or the physical leadership of a church. And we spoke quite a bit about some of this last time, and we talked a little bit about how it is an office in the church, how early churches were self-governed. They weren't related by their governorship or by leadership. Every church was self-governed. Paul always put elders in each church that he started, each church individually. He never had elders over multiple churches. And although eventually in church history we're going to see that occur, it wasn't how it started. So we see that idea in there. We also see elders are always a plurality. We talked about some Greek, talked about these 3 different words we used for elders last week, and how some of those can just mean an elderly person, and some of them are more the idea of, like episkopos, more the idea of the office. Poimen is shepherd, and we talked a little bit about that. We talked a little bit about some of their job, which is to guard the flock, which God has purchased, so that's part of what they do. We talked about the only place in Scripture where it's pasture, which is Ephesians 4:11, and although we see that word used everywhere today, it's really not a good translation. It's not a word that really just means shepherd. It's really what that word means. He appointed some as shepherds and some as teachers. So it's an office of the church. It's something that is done. We looked at some of the church plants in Acts and how Paul planted those. And then I started to talk a little bit about the pastoral epistles, which is 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, and how important those are. And we talk about elderships because they're the only place in the church, only place we have in Scripture that tells us really what the qualifications of an elder should be. So that kind of gets us into this qualification of elders, which is kind of where we were last Wednesday night. So there's two different lists in the Bible that tell us the qualifications of elders. It's 1 Timothy 3, 1 through 7, and Titus 1, 5 through 9. Those are the only two places in Scripture that we have this list. We don't have it in Acts because Paul was putting elders in Acts. He didn't need to write himself a list. He knew the kind of guys he was looking for. He didn't need to write that down. So he didn't need to write it until he was talking to Timothy in Ephesus, especially Titus in Crete. Crete would have been one of Paul's last plants. I mean, that would have been after his release from prison at the end of Acts and before he was beheaded by Nero. So in that very last little span of time, because Paul never went to Crete, as far as we know, through Acts. So it would have been in that last time, what we might call his last missionary journey, that he went to Crete. So I really think in some ways Titus maybe is kind of better. Timothy, he's writing Timothy, and there's several things we see with elderships here. And we're going to talk about a couple of these, because a lot of it we don't have much contention with. But some of it, over time, we've had a lot of contention with. So we need to talk a little bit about some of these things. Now, in Timothy, it says here, if you look at verse 6, not a new convert, so that he will not become conceited and fall into the condemnation incurred by the devil. Now, in Titus, we don't have that. In Titus, because there aren't any old converts in Titus. Okay, it's all new. There's no old guys, because Paul had went there. Paul had left Titus there to start it, and Paul doesn't say not a new convert here because it just wouldn't have been possible. But I think what's fascinating about it is that he was so worried about this happening that he was willing to say, okay, they can be a new convert if you have to have an elder. You know, that's not going to keep somebody from being an elder in Crete, because obviously where Paul's writing to Timothy in Ephesus is an old congregation, so there's guys there that have been in the church for several years at this time. But in Crete, that didn't exist. So in Crete, he doesn't say that. He doesn't say anything about not being a new convert. He doesn't say anything about that. So there's some things that overlap in these two lists, and there's some things that don't. In Titus, it says, for this reason I left you in Crete, and I want you to look especially at what he says in verse 5. He says that you would set in order what remains and appoint elders. Where at? Every city. Crete's not a big island. I mean, if you've ever been there, Crete's not a big island. It's not a big place. I mean, Paul could have said, well, just put some elders in Crete. It wouldn't have been that big a deal. This isn't that big of a place. Paul didn't say that. He says, put elders in every city. And I think that's really important what he says there, because he wants them to each church to have an eldership. And then he says something that we see in both. Husband of one wife, children who believe. We see that in both of these, don't we? Must be above reproach as God's steward, not self-willed, quick-tempered, not addicted to wine, not pugnacious. Does anybody know what pugnacious means? It's 7. Pugnacious kind of means that you start fights. Yeah, kind of means you're a kind of a instigator. You know, in the Greek, a pugnacious person is somebody who is strong-willed, who tends to get in other people's way. Not fond of gain, right, hospitable, loving what is good, sensible, just, devout, self-controlled, holding fast the faithful words in accordance with the teaching. So we don't see that, but if we go back to Timothy, in this case, it's a little more of a list, because these guys are older, been in the church longer. Paul's kind of holding maybe to a little bit more standard than he is the ones in Crete. But we still get this same husband of one wife, temperate, prudent, respectable, able to teach, Not addicted to wine or pugnacious, we get that again. Gentle, peaceable, free from the love of money, which is kind of what you get in Titus. But here we get one who manages his own household well, keeping his children under control with all dignity. But if a man does not know how to manage his own household, how will he take care of the church of God? And not a new convert, so not become conceited, fall into the condemnation incurred by the devil. He must have a good reputation with those outside the church so that he will not fall in reproach and the snare of the devil. So you kind of get the idea of the kind of man that Paul wants to lead the church. But I want to pick a few of these apart because over the years, there's a couple of these that have caused so much problems in the church that I couldn't even begin to tell you the problems this caused. One thing we need to look at is children. So, what does that mean, right? And at what point, and what does it mean to have your children under control? And does that mean you have to have your children under control when they're 40 years old, or does that mean they just have to be in control in your house? We've had all these conversations. Does that mean they have to be your biological children, or can they be adopted? We pick this apart. I'm telling you, we pick it apart. And I've seen it happen here. I've seen it happen. This very thing happened. We had a man here that was an elder here, that was put forth to be an elder here. He only had one child. That child was adopted. And there was problems with that. People said, well, can that be? So we actually called Oklahoma Christian and Stafford North, who's no longer with us, bless his heart. I love Stafford. I didn't think that man would actually ever die. But anyway, Stafford North came down, and it actually met and said, okay, this is, they ask him, what about children, right? Plural. It's plural in the Greek. What does that mean? And Stafford just kind of looked at everybody and he said, if you're filling out a form and they say, do you have children? If you only have one, do you still mark it? Right? It's not one of those things that So, but the reason I bring this up is because we pick this to death. And we pick it so hard that a lot of times men who would be really good elders have not been installed as elders because we want to pick this down to the point that it becomes wrong. Children, manage your household. What does that mean? Well, they're under your supervision. Once your kids leave, what are you supposed to do? Bring them back in and re-raise them? There comes a point where you're not responsible any longer for your children. You are responsible for your children when they are in your household. And I don't think this means that your children never have an issue, never do anything wrong. It just means that your children, we know what it means. Don't we? Why do we make this so hard, Yeah. Oh, I'm sure, yeah. Yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. I think they can be, but on the other hand, I think, there comes a point where you're not responsible for your children anymore, Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's something that's situational. I think if you put somebody forth to be an elder, and maybe they had a child that was grown, but was a real problem and a problem in the community, that might fall under not having a good reputation in the community, or it might fall under how people viewed you as a person. So, there's kind of other things that cover that, if you get down to that type of a thing. There's kind of other things that kind of kick in this list. So, there's nobody that's perfect. You're never going to find a perfect man. You're never going to find a perfect elder. That's just not ever going to happen because none of us are perfect, right? So, if you're looking for somebody that's perfect, we're never going to have an elder because there's no such thing. You're looking for the type of person that is striving for this, that's striving for perfection, that's striving to be the type of person that God would have them to be. And I think that's something that's important. There's people that don't like me. There's people that don't like me in this town, that's just part of it. And I can't make everybody like me. You can't make everybody like you. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the overall character of an individual. How is that man? How How does he deal in the community? How is he with his household? How is he, that type of a person. So that's kind of what we're looking at. Now, the other thing that we've had tremendous problems with over the years is this husband and one wife issue. I've literally had people, I'm not kidding you, I've had people scream at me over this. So I have. I'm going to tell you how I feel about, I'm going to tell you two things. I'm going to tell you kind of what the Greek says, and then I'm going to kind of tell you how I feel about it. And you don't have to agree with me. But what the Greek means by this is a one-woman man. That's what this means. There's a huge difference between the husband of one wife and a one-woman man. Does everybody follow me on this? Do you know what I'm talking about? I've known a lot of guys that were the husband of one wife, but they weren't a one-woman man. You know what I'm saying? Does that make any sense?
But it doesn't mean one woman at a time.
Right. So what this means in the Greek, this is literally, the literal translation of this in the Greek, or the literal idea of this in the Greek, is like a one-person dog. I know that's a terrible illustration, but that's really what that means in the Greek. Have you ever had a dog you know what I'm talking about? You ever had a dog that's a one-person dog? Have you ever had one of those or known somebody that had one of those? That's really what this means. A dog that's devoted to you, right? Listens to your voice, hears your voice, your command, responds to you. Well, that's literally what this means. This means a one-woman man, okay? This means a husband that's not looking around, a husband that's devoted to his wife, a husband that loves his wife and cherishes his wife and treats his wife with the utmost respect. Why is that important? Because the church is what? It's the bride of Christ, right? And if you don't know how to treat your bride, if you don't know how to be a one-woman man, then you don't have no business being an elder. Because that's what Christ wants you to understand. You are a one-woman. The church is the bride of Christ. It's devoted to Christ. We as husbands, men who are elders, have to be devoted to our wives. Now for many years and many commentaries that you read, and many times what I've seen in the church over and over, they'll take somebody who was married at 19 or 20 years old and maybe divorced, maybe before they were ever even a Christian, and they'll say, well, he can't be an elder because he was married before. Rex's opinion, hogwash, right? Has nothing to do with what we're talking about. He's still a one-woman man. If he's devoted to that wife that he has, and especially if it was happened before he was ever a member of the church. And I've had this discussion, and I don't know how a Christian person can accuse someone and hold a sin against them like that Jesus Christ has forgiven. Okay. Okay, too strong. I'll go with that. Very legalistic in their approach. But I don't feel that way. The elders here don't feel that way. But some do. Right. So I just wonder. And I think you bring up a really good point. The elders here don't feel that way. And that's how come we have elders in every church. Some elders do. There's churches where elders absolutely would say, you can't do that. There's congregations where they wouldn't even consider a person who had at some point in their life been previously married. Right. To me, I don't get that. Yeah. But that's why we're all autonomous. Right. That's why we're all our own. Exactly. Very good point.
I think when we read this stuff, it has a lot to do with how it's written. Because you can go back, I went back to King James, to Young's Literal, to the Jewish Literal. And it just says he must be faithful to his wife.
Yeah, faithful to his wife. That's the Jewish or Young's literal? Yeah.
And when we look at how it was meant, as to how we want it to be, sometimes it's a little different. And I've had to change. I used to be hardcore on that, you know that.
Yeah.
You do too. I was like, nope, that's what it says. That's what it means. But maybe not every time.
Yeah, devoted or faithful husband is really what that means. Devoted husband, faithful husband would be a lot better translation.
And some decide that, if the wife died and they remarried it, that's okay. And some say, no, that's the same as divorce. So
Right.
it's an opinion thing,
Yeah.
and that's why the church where you go decides.
And there's another flip to this too that I wanted to talk about for a minute, and that's a lot of times elders, what if the elder's wife dies? Is he still able to be an elder or not?
Some say yes.
Britt says some say yes, some say no. See, I don't think it matters. Now, I know every elder in this congregation doesn't agree with me on that, but I've seen elders step down. And there was a point in my life, I'm going to tell you, when J.A. Riley was here, I love J.A., and when J.A. Riley was here as an elder and Glenda got sick and had that brain bleed in Tulsa, I actually prayed. I said, Lord, don't let Glenda die because J.A. couldn't be an elder. At that point in my life, that's how I felt, you know. But I don't think that disqualifies you from being an elder. I think you are still the husband of one wife, whether your wife has passed or whether your wife is living. I still think you're a husband of one wife. I don't think that changes being a faithful husband when your wife dies. I think you're still faithful. And if you were to remarry, that would be okay, because obviously if your wife dies, you're free to marry. So if you remarried, but I still don't think that disqualifies you from being an elder. Like Brent says, I mean, I got to qualify that. There's people who do think that does, and there's elders here that think it does. So that's not a unanimous decision here by no means. But in Rex's humble opinion, it doesn't change the type of man that they are if their wife dies. I still think they're still that man. I don't think the day your wife dies, you're no longer a faithful husband. I don't.
Let's say your wife died, and before she died, you were a terrible husband.
Yeah.
And then you want to be an elder? No.
Right.
What kind of husband were you?
Right.
And everybody knows you. So there's a difference.
Sure.
But you were an elder, or this great husband, and your wife died. Everybody knew what kind of husband you were. They knew it.
Right. So like I said, we can get real legalistic, and that's a really great term, and Brent threw that in there, and I appreciate that. We can get super legalistic about this. We can take it for the letter. The older I get, and the more I've read this, and the more I've been around congregations, and the more I've been around elderships, the more I think a real legalistic look at this is a wrong approach to this. This is the type of person that you want to lead, and I believe leadership is so important in a church. I believe that when we disqualify people, when we hold people to such a standard that you can't have any elders, I believe that's a sin just as much as not following this. You know, I believe we need to have elders. And I think when you look at the difference in Titus and Crete, Paul made a difference here. He didn't say not a new convert. There was a reason.
If you're going to take it so literally, the very first one, the man needs to be blameless.
Yeah.
Show me a blameless man.
Yeah.
But yet, if you say, But's blameless, he's a good guy, I know what you mean. I know
Right.
what you mean. But if you want to take it literally blameless, do you know anything?
Yeah, that's what I mean. You can't. That's what I mean. If you want to find a perfect elder, perfect man, you're not going to find that.
You would have to be a eunuch, and then you're not going to have a wife.
There you go. Yeah. So,
To be perfectly blameless, that's what you would have to be.
right. So I think, as we go through that and look at that, and you're welcome to go back and look at that, and you can read 1,000 commentaries on this, and you're going to get, you're going to get 5 or 6 different takes on exactly how this reads. But I think it's really looking for the kind of man you want to lead. You want somebody who's dedicated, who's faithful, who's a good man, an honest man. You just want a good guy, And I think it's important that they have a good, I think that marriage relationship for an elder is important. I mean, I don't think you would want to have an elder who didn't I think that would definitely disqualify a man if, he had issues with his married life. I think that because we're looking at somebody who's needs to be able to manage those relationships with children, with wives, with outside. That's the kind of man you're looking for. So I definitely think could be disqualified, but I think.
So would you agree that whatever eldership you're under, you should fall in line?
I think we put ourselves under the authority of our eldership. And I think if the elders say, that's tough, I think if the elders say, my opinion is yes, I'm going to follow what the elders say, even if I don't agree with it, unless it's something that I think is just totally an unscriptural or totally a wrong way, then I'm going to go with what my elders say, because I just think I have to do that. Now if I can say, oh, this absolutely, what you guys are saying absolutely is not right, and I can show you in the Bible where you're not right, that's a little bit different situation.
Somebody not long ago, they didn't like some of the things that we did. It's our opinion. We're doing the best we can, but I said, I guarantee you, if you're looking for everything that's just what you think it should be, you won't be anywhere very long. Just because we do it, like you just said, I forget how you just said it. You don't have to totally believe it. You can still have your own thought, but don't be upset because we all don't see it exactly the same.
Right.
You know what I mean?
And that's part of leadership. I mean, everybody's never going to be 100% happy, but we have to find that common ground. That's right. And elders have to look at what's better for a whole congregation, not just one person. I mean, there's things you might do that maybe it's all right, but you'd have 10 people leave too. I mean, you have to look at unity. You have to look at what keeps us unified, and it's a really big thing in a congregation. So, why do we have elders, right? Well, we've kind of talked about that a little bit, but we have them because that's our example. I mean, that is the only scriptural example of church leadership in the Bible, period, no exceptions. There is no other way. I mean, there's just not another example. It does not exist. Why did we go to popes? Why did we go to leadership like we have? I'm going to tell you, a lot of that is historical, a lot of that is political. The early church was closely tied into the state. Rome, it was a church of, Rome. Christianity became the state religion of Rome. And let's face it, if you're a Roman emperor and you want to control the Christians, they need to have a leader. That Roman emperor needs to have somebody he can go to and say, you need to make all this happen. And that's what the Pope became. He became that guy that the emperor or the king or whoever could go for. If you were in England, it was Archbishop, right? Archbishop of Canterbury. You had to have somebody that you could go to and say, this is what we're going to do. You need to make it happen. So the church got really, really, over the history, got very, very political. And I believe that has a lot to do with, how the church became structured. And then as churches came to the United States, as congregations, it became, and I always think about Roy when I think about this because it's something we've talked about, church became a business. And the truth is, the most efficient way to run a business is to have managers and to have leaders and to have people and to have a central organization. And it became very businesslike. But like I said, we're not a business, right? The church has business, but we're not a business. So we have to do that. Never in the Bible, in the New Testament, elders were never over more than one congregation. Never. Elders were over each individual congregation. And I think, and this is just Rex, Sometimes when I look around and I think, man, it would be really nice if, our elders could maybe over Walika, help Walika, or help whatever, right? But that's not how this works. It's never been how this works. And we can't start that now. It's just not how it's set up. We don't have any other biblical example of any other type of rule, right? At all.
Bear in mind, there's nothing wrong with those elders calling ours and asking for advice.
No, elders can talk, elders can give advice, elders can, but at the end of the day, that's right. And if our elders don't agree with Shakota or Okima's elders don't agree with ours, at the end of the day, that's not a make or break thing. I mean, that's just how it is, right? So, but also it makes it a little bit iffy when you walk into a church of Christ somewhere in another city. You never know what you might be walking into because you don't know. You don't know how their elders, you don't know what their elders are doing or how their elders are responding. So you might walk into an instrumental church, or you might walk into a church that have women praying or women serving on the Lord's table. So that's things that you might see, and we're going to talk about women in this eventually, and we'll talk about some of these things because there's a lot of churches that are moving in that direction, right? So we need to talk about that. Yeah. Anybody? Somebody had something. Teresa was going to say something.
If you went into worship at a church that did stuff different than us, it doesn't mean you couldn't go in and worship and take communion, and then, you're still under your leadership.
Yeah, I think it depends. We've walked into some churches that did some things that I never, was I comfortable with it? Because I never do it that way. Was I comfortable? No, not really. But then at the end of the day, when I really sat down and looked at it, like, is it wrong? Not really wrong. It's just, it wasn't Rex's way, but it wasn't really wrong, So it was okay, So that's something you have to decide for yourselves. I can't, we used to travel and we used to shoot the kids in before we go in, make sure they were on the piano, So it just depends on how you are, depends on that's something you have to decide, because like I said, you never know really what you're walking into when you walk into a Church of Christ. 95% of the time, you're going to walk into something that looks just about like this. 5% of the time, 10% of the time, you're going to walk into something that doesn't. So you just have to, it's something you have to know, and right, because we're not connected. So,
Rex, in Australia, every church has instruments, and a lot of them have women running the church.
mm-hmm.
And all those churches are fine. What are you going to do? You want to go ahead and pray? You want to take communion? You're going to participate. You can't always walk out.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Church of Christ that Laura and Trevor are in it's Church of Christ, but it looks a lot different than us, And, they say a lot of things too, like wallaby and stuff, but it's different other than that too, So it's necessary, right? Even in young congregations, elders, leadership in a church is necessary. It's vital for the growth of a congregation. It's something that we have to do. Why do we have elders? Because it's the only scriptural example of leadership of God's people, congregations that are self-governed, autonomous by a plurality of elders. So to me, it's important. When I first became a member of the church, I was in Walika. Walika was a little bitty. Walika did not have elders. Yes and no, they had a couple of guys who did things that were qualified to be elders that should have just had the title of elders, but they didn't technically have quote elders. At that time, it really didn't bother me that much. Now I probably would struggle to be at a church who didn't have elders. I think probably would bother me. Just honest, I think it would probably bother me. I think it's that important. Even in a small congregation, I think it's that important. Okay, so purpose. So in Acts 20, it says, "Be on guard for yourselves and for all the flock, among which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers." Now that's episkopos there, so that's really talking about the office. To shepherd, now we see the word poimen, the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. Know that after my departure, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock, and from among your own selves men will arise, speaking perverse things to draw away the disciples after them. Therefore, be on the alert, remembering that night and day, for a period of 3 years, I did not cease to admonish each one with tears. So elders are spiritual leaders. They should monitor what's taught. They should monitor what's preached. They should monitor all the things that go on spiritually in this church, from the things that I say, the things I teach, to things that teachers teach in classes, Bible class material. All those things are under the leadership of elderships here, should be under our elders. Their job is to make sure that what's taught is biblical and what's taught is honest and true and in line with how they want to lead our particular congregation. So, and I think that's important, because I could go off preaching about a lot of things that maybe wouldn't be wrong, that maybe wouldn't be in line with the direction that the elders want us to go. So there has to be a relationship between ministers and elders. There has to be an understanding between ministers and elders, because when ministers go rogue, away from their elderships, it's a nightmare. So, and that happens, and I've seen that happen in churches, and that's not a place you want to be. Ministers need to be in line with the eldership. In 1 Peter 5, it says, therefore I exhort the elders among you as your fellow elder, Peter says here, and witness of the sufferings of Christ, and a partaker also of the glory that is revealed. Shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but voluntarily, according to the will of God, and not for sordid gain, but with eagerness, nor yet as lording it over those allotted to your charge, but proving to be examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you will receive the unfading crown of glory. I've been in churches where we had elders that really had an agenda, and that's a really bad place to be. Elders have to work together. You can't have a chief elder. That's not how this works. And I've been to churches where some elder, for whatever reason, maybe he donated more money than everybody else, or maybe he thought he was more educated than everybody else, or maybe he was whatever. He wanted to be the head guy. There's no head guys. No head elders. Doesn't exist, right? They're just elders. So that's something you can't tolerate. You can't have guys that want to be the chief elder. There's a lot here. If you want to look at that, you can take a picture of that slide or whatever, but there's a lot here. Elders oversee God's people. We see that in Acts, 1 Thessalonians, Hebrews, and 1 Peter. Elders teach doctrine. Elders should be teachers. They should have enough of an understanding of God's word to be able to know what's right and wrong. They should be teachable, but they should be teachers. That's a problem in churches today, because most ministers are way more educated than the elders that oversee them. A lot of ministers have doctorates in theology, very educated individuals. Sometimes that causes problems in churches, because the ministers think they need to be able to teach their elders what the elders should think. Bad situation. Elders should be godly men. Elders should be able to teach. Elders should be able to resolve differences. That's a big thing. Conflict resolution. That's a big job for elders, and probably one of the worst jobs that elders have, and it doesn't always go the way they want it to go. Doesn't always go the way I want it to go or we want it to go, but it's something that they struggle with, and it's something that they have to be able to do. They have to be able to resolve differences within a congregation, and we as sheep should be able to go to our elders with problems in the congregation, and we should be able to talk to our elders about those problems, and they should be involved in that resolution. That's part of their job. That's part of what they do. Elders commission leaders. Ministers, I'm under the authority of our eldership, as any other minister here would be. They are to commission our leaders. And we've had a preacher here one time that says the elders couldn't fire him because he was commissioned by God, and the elders couldn't fire him because he was commissioned by God. That's not true. That's not how this works at all, right? That was the craziest thing I've ever been involved in too. Anyway, and elders minister to the sick. We see that in James 5:14 through 15. Elders come and pray over the sick. James says anoint them with oil. We've had our elders have done that. People have requested our elders to go and anoint with oil and pray over people. That's fine. If the elders would do that, if you requested them to do that. Personally, I don't really want to smear oil on me. I'm praying. I'm good with the praying part. But you know, they would do that, and they've done that. We've had that happen here. So elders do a lot in a congregation. Elders oversee a lot in our congregation, and elders deserve our respect. They deserve our submission, and they deserve our support because their job is not easy. And you and I, as sheep, we need to be good sheep, right? Who can be an elder? Those men who meet the requirements set forth in Titus and 1 Timothy. And like I said, a lot of discussion about those requirements in different congregations. Every congregation is not going to accept certain men to be elders. Other congregations will. So, like I said, there's a lot of conversation there, a lot of division there, and I want to talk about our responsibility before I get through with this. So we'll do that. I'm probably not going to be here next Wednesday. You're probably going to get Buck. Buck can teach that if he wants to, but I'm going to have surgery next Tuesday, and I probably ain't going to be up to being here. So, but I'll. I mean, I might. I mean, I'm all right with it. I mean, chances are I can do it, brother. If my elders tell me to do it, I'll do it. I'll drug up and be here now. So, but anyway, thanks for your time.